What is good, everybody? Who's like got us back with another video. In this one, I'm going to be talking about the significance of 40 throughout the Bible. So that's something you're curious about, or something you want to know, or something you're willing to chop it up and hear some ideas about, then you found the right video. So let's dive right into it. The number 40 is a number that occurs throughout the Bible. We see it in both testaments, and the way they connect is actually pretty significant. So I figure I'll start by talking about the ways in which the number 40 appears throughout the Bible. And this is actually straight from GotQuestions.org. So if y'all are curious, I'll link that in the description. You could go see for yourselves. But we have plenty of examples where it's actually because of these that some individuals and some biblical scholars believe that 40 has something to do with judgment, some representation of judgment, because the first appearance of 40 was actually the days and nights that the world would be covered with water in Noah's flood, Genesis 7:12. After Moses killed the Egyptian, he fled to Midian, where he spent 40 years in exile. Acts 7:30. Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. This is, at the same time when the whole golden calf incident would happen. That is Exodus 24:18. Moses interceded on Israel's behalf for 40 days and 40 nights. Deuteronomy 9:18-25. Here's one that's interesting, is that the amount of lashes that someone could get for punishment was capped at 40. So the direct punishment was capped at 40 lashes, which is why in Jesus' day they would have I think it was like 40 lashes less one, or 39 lashes less one, to ensure that they wouldn't violate the capping, to make sure they wouldn't just do more than 40 by accident. So that's something that's pretty interesting. Here's the famous one. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. That one's going to be the most significant for our purposes, because we're going to circle back to that in the New Testament. Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, which is the duration of time that the old generation that haven't believed and was doubting God, they would all have died away by the time the new generation would have entered the promised land, and they wouldn't have been corrupted by this doubt that the old generation had. So that's something that's interesting too. That is a direct reason for the 40 years in the wilderness story. So there's that layer. I'll put the scriptural verse in there. So those are some examples of the number 40 in the Old Testament. But I also think, this is my own personal opinion, right? Because of this, there are people and scholars who think that the number 40 has to do with judgment, and has to do with like times of judgment and tribulation. And I agree with that in terms of its symbolic significance. I agree with that. But at the same time, I also think there's a sense in which the number 40 represents a time of completion, a period of fulfillment. Because in the Bible, King David, King Saul, and King Solomon were all said to reign for 40 years in Israel, when Israel was still a unified state. After Solomon's rule, they would split between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, before there was a roughly 120-year period where each king reigned for exactly or roughly 40 years. So I also think if we want to say there's any symbolic significance to that, the number 40 could be just a nice round figure to represent a period of completion, a nice, round figure to represent the time in which the prophets and the kings acted and did what God wanted them to do in that time frame, to bless the children of Israel and to lead them in the right way before the nation would be divided. And then I think those connect to in the New Testament, because when 40 appears in the New Testament, we have Jesus being tested for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. And then between his resurrection and ascension, there was actually a 40-day window where Christ was appearing to people and talking to people and having conversations even about the future of the nation of Israel, in a 40-day window before he actually fully ascended to the Father. So that's another thing. That's another reason why I think the number 40 also has nuances that relate to completion, and just a nice, beautiful, for just a round figure of time in which God's purposes are completed before, whatever happens, before the next stage, before the next era is ushered in. So I want to say that as far as symbolic significance goes. One thing to remember is that the Bible never gives a direct answer into why the number 40 is so significant. Now, there are some verses that do, because in the Messianic writings in the book of Revelation, we have 666. And the verse actually tells you, like, one who has wisdom should calculate the meaning of 666 because it's the number of the man. And if you actually start going into the Greek and stuff, it basically spells out Caesar Nero, Nero's name, who was a really, he was one of the emperors that really persecuted the first century church. So there are some verses where it actually does give you a direct open door to try to interpret and figure out what it means, what the significance point blank is. Though with the number 40, it doesn't ever explicitly give a reason on what the number represents. So what we're left to do is to look at the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament, try our best to understand everything in the cultural context, and just look at what's happening in the passages to try to figure out what symbolic stuff could the number 40 represent, whether it be times of judgment and times of completion and God accomplishing his purposes with humanity. Now, with all that being said, one of the greatest parallels between that is how Israel was 40 years in the wilderness, and how Christ, also in the wilderness, was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights by the devil. Now, that's significant because in this way, the Gospels are presenting Christ as like a new Israel. It is Christ is Israel's new Israel, so to speak. He is the Messiah who is fulfilling the test and actually, passing the test that the Israel wilderness generation failed way back in the day. So in this way, from a messianic perspective, from a New Testament perspective, we can look back on Isaiah 49 and see it's right for the servant to be called Israel, because after all, we have the one who was fulfilling the tasks that Israel originally failed, especially the old generation. So, in doing so, it's cool to see the way that the New Testament presents Christ as both a new Israel, as both were taken and called out of Egypt, but also a new Moses. So there's a whole thing, the whole similarities to Moses is a different video in itself, and I do, God willing, plan to make that. But I just want to dive in because even with the number itself, we can speculate the way they're used definitely has links between the testaments. They're in the wilderness, which symbolically is like the territory of the Elohim, the territory of the unclean spirits. We see this told to us in the New Testament, but also in terms of the territory of Azazel in the New Testament. Wherever Yahweh is a sacred space, and on the Day of Atonement, they would sacrifice one of their goats, but they would send the other goat out to Azazel. In other words, this other goat, which represents our sins, goes out into the wilderness and out of our own sacred space where Yahweh dwells. So, in this way, we sort of get the idea that the wilderness represents, where the bad spirits are, the territory of the bad spirits that have, ultimately, we could say, abstractly been reclaimed by God through Christ. If we want to get into the whole thing about how the world was converted to Yahweh worship, the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of Christ, we can get into that whole rabbit hole. But this whole notion about that and how that's even repeated in the New Testament, because it talks about how there was a commonly held belief that the wilderness, especially the desert places, which is where Christ was or John the Baptist was like just the places where unclean spirits would be and congregate. They were associated with dry desert places and wildernesses. So we have Israel in the territory of the unclean spirits, or in the territory of the Elohim, that doubt God and even build golden calves and fail their test, and God sentences to a judgment of wandering for 40 years as a nomadic people until the old generation dies out and the new generation can be raised up in the faith without being corrupted from the doubts of the old generation into the promised land. All right, so Israel failed the test, but then we have Christ put in the same circumstance, going one-on-one with Satan in the wilderness against the unclean spirits, against the adversary, and he actually passed the test. And here's the thing, he passes the test with Scripture. So another principle that we can take away is we need to know the Bible because the devil knows it too. That's a fascinating thing to conjecture about. The devil knows this Bible. The devil knows the Scriptures enough to try to twist them. So that's why we got to be girded up in the word and in the scriptures to know when the devil or someone might be trying to take them out of context so we can satisfy our flesh or what have you. And Jesus quoted from Deuteronomy more than any other book, as we can see. So Christ is tempted, but he completes the test. He doesn't fail, and he's vindicated because angels come and minister to him and all of that. And after that, he's just vindicated to go on and start preaching to the 12 tribes, and ultimately, as we can see from our vantage point and in the book of Acts, to the Gentiles. So Christ will Christ, by passing the test of staying faithful to God in the wilderness, was equipped and vindicated for his ministry of actually preaching the good news to the people. You get what I'm saying? So that's all I wanted to do. This was a little bit of a shorter video, but here's some thoughts about the number 40, the way it's used between the testaments, and just the significance of the way it relates to Christ and the New Testament and the Messianic writings, as I love to call them. Now, if y'all have any ideas about the significance of 40, I honestly invite you to drop them in the comments. I love when people comment and I get to interact with y'all, especially in matters like this. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are about 40. And tell me, if you got an idea, tell me where you're getting it from so I could go and look at it too. All right, so thank y'all. Y'all be blessed in the Most High. Y'all be blessed in the Messiah. And I'll see you in the next video. One thing I also want to say is I do want to make a gratitude live stream tomorrow, God willing. If anybody comes, that'd be great. I'm just going to come and say gratitude at this point for all my subscribers and all the views that I had, because I wanted to do this after I hit 10,000. But now I have 13,000, so that's even more reason to be grateful. If any of y'all actually come to the live stream, then we can chop it up. If you have any questions, then I like to answer them one-on-one. But if nobody comes, then it'll just be a quick thing. I'll say like, what's good? Thank you for everything, and then I'll end it and put it on my channel. But that'll be tomorrow. I have to think about when, probably 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. But let me know if y'all want to come to that. Y'all be blessed in the Messiah. I'll see you in the next one. God bless.